And of course, good evening. It's June 25th, 2024. And we're in our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. It's a series from the Bible Project. It's about the entire TaNaK, right? The Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the TaNaK, that Old Testament source video section set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture first. They would all be found in their respective source video playlists. We try to keep these to about 15 minutes or so, make them easier to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist at times, on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, it's when you click the subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think that these might be useful to other people as well, that's when you click that like button. Because that is the way the YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So in this series, we're going to be covering the entire TaNaK, right? The Old Testament. And yet, we're going to be doing it in the original order of the collection, right? The Hebrew Scriptures order. It's going to get interesting after the first 5. But right now, we're in the TaNaK, Genesis, Bereshit, 1 through 11, and this is our part 4. So we were at those men of renown, right? The Nephilim. And really, again, if you want to delve more into that, because we're not doing it here, like we mentioned last week, go over to Anchor to Truth. Link is in the description below, because they have a bit more to say on this particular matter. But it's them and the rest of humanity, really, that is in rebellion. Changes need to be made. The tipping point has been reached. And I like the way that Tim summed it up, this period of time, this nutshell phrase, that these folks were building kingdoms that were abusing relationships. They're abusing people. They're abusing creation. They're doing all this counter to God. They're trying to be all they can be, but not in a good way. It's very much all about them and not about God. So then we're going to get this next event, the flood. Yes, that big water event. This is how it's going to happen. God's seeing all that we've done, what humans have done to this beautiful creation. He decides to refresh it, right? Wiping the slate up a bit cleaner. Because this is the first time that God has mentioned that he's actually regretted part of creation. He's frustrated and angry, and he wants to start again. We're going to get similar thoughts later in Scripture, just nothing to this magnitude. Okay? So here's another interesting question that kind of rolls around in my head. It's purely hypothetical, and yet maybe leaves a thought to be pondered later. Because couldn't God have just destroyed humanity? I mean, just humanity, left nature as it was? Because there's no scriptural reference to the rest of creation being at fault. Just the human and human-like creatures. They're the culprits. But God chooses to restart with a limited number of people. Actually, in Scripture, really get a reference to only one man, Noah. The family is just part of the deal. Yet everything else, everything that walks and crawls on the earth that's not on the ark, it's eradicated. I mean, there were a few birds brought on the ark, purpose-driven for sure, more than 2. And I suspect that there still could have been many others, even with the birds, that could have survived the flood. And then fish, kind of obvious, but everything else, and of course, all of the humans, are removed. A man, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. They will be all that remain and move on. So much in this story is known and so much is unknown. There's detail and then there's none at all. And there's references to, as of yet, unknown practices. God gives this man a task. That task takes him years to accomplish. Details about the ark, and yet no details. Outer dimensions, how to seal it, the material to build it. Bit of detail there. But the interior, that's left to the imagination. You know, it seems like a trademark of God in many ways, as we've seen through Scripture, right? Directions, and then we have to fill in. God gives us room to do our thing. We have the animals that are summoned by God and they enter the ark at the appointed time. All the animals that he sends. Which ones are going to be part of the reset? And of course, there's need to be animals for food for these people and for sacrifice. And we get a reference to clean animals. You know, it's interesting. We tend not to talk about them in stories when we hear we're talking about the flood because it complicates the story. Yet this is the first reference to clean animals. So now for us, those not raised on Torah as a whole, this is problematic. So at times, often just better left unsaid. But for the children of Israel, like we've been saying, they are looking back. They're very aware of this. They're probably not even really surprised about it at all. But like I mentioned before, in my mental thing that I have, where I put questions in a box, put them on a shelf, some of those to be readdressed when the time comes and I have more information, and others, well, they're going to need to be answered long after I'm gone. But for us, let's put the clean animals question in a box, as in what they are and why, and we're going to definitely get to this later. I'm actually looking forward to it. So for now, we're on the other side of the flood. The waters have subsided. The door opened. Tim put it, the Noah element, right? Okay, so we've started afresh. We clean the slate. So maybe one could see garden elements here. I mean, if you know Hebrew, and we do not, so it helps to have scholars and teachers that do, and they see the parallels and the verbiage used. Tim helps point that out. Rabbi Foreman's helped point that out. Skip Moen helps point that out. Garden imagery, garden terminology, it's wrapped all up in this. But I have it that it's in a different sense, because it's almost like it's distorted, meaning it's not as it was intended, right? The pattern, it looks similar. We hear the words, but in my mind, it's like the colors are all wrong. The shapes are different. I mean, this might be parallel in verbiage to help us see the similarities, but the picture, it couldn't be more different. I mean, the effects of the flood are all around. Soaked, dead earth, 40 days of heavy weather. What was alive, now dead. And that life, dead life, is all around. The picture here is literally not the Garden of Eden. Yet, it is a beginning. It is a fresh start. Noah begins again. But this is an apocalyptic world. Most of us probably seen or at least heard about, or a story, a book, a movie about surviving in an apocalyptic event. But these are literally the only 8 people on the planet. And it looks very different from what they'd left. You know, at times, and I think about this, if I were Noah and I got out of the ark and, you know, we're looking around and we're seeing this, and I've been a follower of God, but I've never seen God act like this. It's interesting. We think, uh, okay, so we think we know where we're at in our point in history, right? This wonderful selection of scrolls we call scripture. But right now, we're only columns in, right? Remember, this is written in Hebrew, right to left, in columns, not in chapters, not in verses. We're still at a very early part of the story. We're just lines in. But we know, sitting here, that we already have a predisposed image of God. We already know, or at least think we know, about this God that Noah's dealing with. But if we were living it in the direction that it's being read or told to them, and the story is yet unknown, then this does give us some interesting pictures indeed, right? Because prior to this, with the exception, I'd say it's a rather obvious exception, of the miracle of creation, we have no record of large-scale miracles affecting people, like those plagues in Egypt much later in the story. But that has not happened yet. And we have almost zero information about how God has dealt with man on a daily basis. How any of that might have manifested. We just have God approaching Noah after seeing his character lived out on his daily life. He gives him a task. We really don't know if Noah really has an indicator of that he grasps the scale of what's going to happen. I mean, the words are there, but do you really grasp it? Because what Noah does see is this God that chose to rescue him and his family, and Noah did his part. He built the ark. He watched those animals arrive. The rain commences. 40 days later, they're out in a world forever changed. Because we're now seeing destruction on a scale that is literally unimaginable. And they're all alone. 8 people. All alone. I think the interactions with God, talking to Noah, right, with that. And I think the interaction with God, talking to Noah, with the promise of a rainbow, I think it's greater, it's bigger, it's larger, it's more impactful than even the credit that we give it. Because Noah's got to be scared. All went bad. The world, now, thought it was a mess before. Look at the mess outside. Because he gets out and he sees it. For me, I would be shell-shocked. So God needs to reassure him, to put Noah at peace. That God, he's not going to do it again. God needed to say to him, I promise I won't do that again. And I'll make sure that everybody else that follows you is aware of that promise as well. They need to know the promise, and they need to be able to see my response. Because it's a fair question. If God had done that, why'd you ever just do it again? I mean, there would be no reason why I would believe that he wouldn't do it again. But he says, I promise. And this is my promise displayed. For every human after you, they're going to see it and attest to it. The rainbow is going to be that covenant seal. Yeah. And just like Noah, I don't need an archaeological dig because I get to see it. I get to see the real thing. We actually get to see the promise. It's something to ponder for him because he saw the first one. And he's still going, okay, but I still have to live to start again. 8 people, all alone. And he begins. We don't get much of a story as to what Noah did before this, right? We don't get a story about what job he had or what task he had. We know they had to build an ark. Doesn't mean he was a carpenter, but at least some woodworking skills would have been handy. God gave him instructions. maybe directions might be a better word. Because we still have to do the work. We have to follow the directions. But no, he's not a puppet. He's not possessed to build this. Still has to work it out. I like that interaction with God. He gives us directions and then we live them out. We do our part. Noah had the task of the ark. But he still had also a new and different life on the other side of that ark. So we have something new there. When we get to this point, he's now also on the other side of the ark. We see his farmer skills, or at least he needs to be that out of necessity. In the vineyard, it plays a part. I can probably see that Noah planted a lot more than just a vineyard because those 8 people had to eat. Because there's not many other folks to trade with for services and material. But anyone that knows about vineyards knows it takes years for a vine to mature to a point to produce grapes that can be made into wine. So maybe that's why the vine in this story is important as well, right? Because I expect there's going to be more than one thing seen in the grape vineyard. But one of them could be just referencing, when we get this, that time has passed. Years have gone by. And we're going to approach the very next important and impactful event in this section. And wine, now done, is going to play a very important part. So next week, we're going to continue with opening the Torah in Genesis and Bereshit. We're going to wrap up this section of chapters 1 through 11 with our part 5. So, thanks again for being with us tonight as we continue our new series, TaNaK, the Old Testament, and outside the class, on the Dusty Feet.